Okay, I'm Esra Özürek. I'm the chair for Contemporary Turkish Studies at the European Institute. And today we'll be discussing the book, The Headscarf Debates, Conflicts of National Belonging. It's written by Professor Anna Kortalek. She's the Associate Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology, University of Toronto. And also with Professor Gökçe Yurdakul. She is the Georg Zimmer Professor of Diversity and Social Conflict at the Humboldt University, Berlin Graduate School of Social Sciences. And our discussants today are Dr. Ruth Mandel from the Anthropology Department at University College London. For a long time she wrote about issues that relate to immigration in Germany. She has this fantastic book called Cosmopolitan Anxieties. I forgot the rest of the
Turkish challenges to citizenship and belonging in Germany.
In Germany, yeah, it is, yeah, definitely the most fascinating ethnography of Turkish presence in Germany. So if you're into that topic, it's definitely a great, great read. Also, not only conceptually challenging. And then Asma Soliman, here we have her as PhD candidate, but I'm hoping in 3 days we'll have her as Dr. Asma Soliman. In the School of European Languages, Culture and Society at the University College London. She wrote a fantastic dissertation about Muslim youth culture in Germany. And after they will comment on the book, and I'll comment on the book, and then Gökçe and Anna will respond, and we'll open it to discussion. So, Ruth, please.
Oh, first. Thank you. And sit here.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. If you can't hear me, wave or something, okay? So, I'm very pleased to be here, and wonderful to see old friends. Well, the Headscarf Debates, Conflicts of National Belonging is a rare book. There's many books, many works that claim to be comparative, but far fewer that actually accomplish this difficult and challenging feat. And the Headscarf Debates is one of the successful few that deeply understands and demonstrates the basis of comparative social science. How does it do this? By being focused, rigorous, and specific about its aims and purview, and by doing the homework. This book takes 4 countries, Germany, Turkey, France, and the Netherlands, and attempts to understand the polysemic meanings of Muslim women's headscarves from a variety of points of view. It pursues an interesting strategy of content analysis, mined from a considerable range of several newspapers in each of the 4 countries, along with some interviews with key players in the field. Now, as Esra just mentioned, 25 years ago, I published an article in which I discussed headscarf debates in Germany. If I had known then that a quarter century later this would still be a topic for discussion and analysis, I would not have believed it. But headscarves then were, and still are today, the keenly fetishized symbol around which much of the debate about us and them, insiders, outsiders, centers. When I was carrying out research in the 1980s in what was then West Germany and West Berlin, the women wearing the headscarves were not referred to as Muslims. They were simply Turks, or Ausländer, outsiders, foreigners. Not much longer before that, they had been Gastarbeiter, guest workers, until the pejorative nature of that term was rendered politically incorrect. Back then, I wrote that the headscarf was seen by many in Germany as a barrier to integration. Now, in the subsequent decades, and I'm really, aging myself right now, the end of the Cold War, the unification of Germany, the events of 9/11, the seemingly endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the economic crash of 2008, together have irrevocably altered the social, cultural, economic, and political landscapes. For example, with German unification, the emergence of a new other, the Ossis, from East Germany, threw the Turks and other foreigners into a new relief. Social hierarchies were shifted and rejigged along with national and transnational identities. The end of the Cold War and its Manichaean worldview left a vacuum that many observers believe has been filled by a recently conveniently constructed Muslim other. War fatigue, hugely draining on the economies of the Western coalition partners, nurtures even more resentment against the Muslim others engaged in the conflicts. Now, the theme of this book indirectly articulates with these larger macro events. As the book shows, the headscarf and hijab today are perceived by some not just as a barrier, but an affront and even a rejection of integration. So it's an enormously useful endeavor in that it undermines the dangerously homogenizing discourse and beliefs that have been increasingly represented by escalating Islamophobia. Sadly, the timing could not be better. In the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attack, facile assumptions about Muslims can be heard daily in every quarter. Another important contribution the book makes is its linking of sartorial practices with nation-state specific contexts. As they write, national belonging is fundamentally about demarcating difference. The authors demonstrate convincingly that it is critical that we identify the different sorts of difference expressed in diverse national settings. For example, Germany in particular is a complex case, as the Nazi past, often used as a historical reference point to discuss Germanness, is problematically not shared by the post-war immigrants, today's Muslims. So what does this say about German identity? Thus, the author suggests that immigrant youth frame their belonging in terms of the city or even a certain city district, rather than the country they live in order to challenge the negative connotations of national belonging. And I'll add that this is consonant with my earlier findings as well. Now, moving on to France, the authors paint an extremely thorough picture of the complex historical forces that have shaped today's troubling scene. The colonial past, along with the Republic's particular version of laïcité, secularism, are anything but straightforward and have been manipulated in a multitude of ways in different places and times. French Republican values dominate much of the discourse, and the subtle and not so subtle contradictions are well represented in this chapter. The authors pose many questions and represent a diverse set of viewpoints. Can one be veiled or scarfed and French, and possibly even a feminist, all at the same time? These and other issues are dealt with in a scholarly and sympathetic approach. Equally fascinating is the chapter about reinventing the headscarf in Turkey. One insight worth mentioning is the discussion of the role of social class and the headscarf. This highlights some of the contradictions in the Turkish Republic's approach to the issue. The embedded ironies of a predominantly Muslim-identified country with nearly 1 century of staunchly secularist governments and policies are dealt with extremely thoughtfully, particularly in light of the current AK Parti's radical changes to the laws and tolerance of explicit signs of Islamic visibility. A further observation the book makes is what I would call projection. In other words, critics of the burqa, the headscarf, niqab, ostensibly presuming to speak for the women who wear them. The Netherlands' Geert Wilders, for example, believes that women wearing these garments are ashamed of how they look. Many other observers project their own assumptions, a particularly frequent one being a presumed lack of agency on the part of women, who must, they believe, have been coerced into submission by male relatives. Again, the focus on the Netherlands demonstrates the book's significant contribution in highlighting the specific nation-state's social and political structures and how it deals with the issues at hand. In this case, it is the history and nature of pillarization, the Dutch way of tolerating diversity by living apart together in essentially parallel societies that comes to the fore. Especially so when contrasted to the French model of Republican égalité that denies such publicly sanctioned diversity. The authors claim that the history of polarization is coming to an end, implying, I take it, that the current immigration situation has upended it. In the discussion, perhaps they can elaborate a bit more on this. Also in the discussion, perhaps we can address some questions that occurred to me as I was reading the book. I would be interested to know why the choice was made to focus on newspapers, for example, rather than other kinds of data, more interviews or other kinds of methods. And I wonder what sorts of difference that would have made. In addition, though it's mentioned several times, the issue of transnationalism does not get the attention it might. I wonder how the dynamics of a transnational, multi-mediated world affect the cross-cultural understandings of headscarf practices. Anthropologists Emma Tarlow and Yael Navarro-Yashun both have written about the politics of style and fashion vis-a-vis scarves and hijab. One cannot get on a tube or bus in London without noticing changing styles. Are transnational flows at work here? In retelling national narratives, the closing chapter, questions of super diversity and mature multiculturalism are raised. Stephen Vertebek is cited here. Brief but helpful summarizing comparisons with Canada, the UK, and the US answered some of the questions I had wondered about in previous chapters. Ultimately, the volume brings together the specificity of national narratives along with the common concerns and practices that override national difference. And just to finish, all good books raise as many questions as they answer, and this one is not an exception. So I look forward to discussing it further, and I will stop here and allow others to speak more. Thank you.
Okay, now Asma.
So I just wanted to say thanks for Headscarf for organizing such a brilliant event. Also thanks to the authors for writing such a brilliant book, and also thanks to you for your deep reflection. So I will firstly I will go through a couple of points that I think are important to get an insight into the book. And afterwards I will talk more specifically about specific concepts which are always associated with the headscarf, and I will focus on gender equality. And then at the end I will raise some questions that I think are important in this context. So what does the book do? The book gives you a discursive analysis of different productions, of narratives of national belonging through looking at the different headscarf debates, and as was said, represented with 4 different countries. And I think including Turkey is a very interesting contribution, because it also shows you how this issue is dealt with in a Muslim majority country, and also how there are some concepts taken from non-Muslim majority countries about how the headscarf is viewed. What the book also says is that these debates, such as the headscarf debates, are typically a response to a feeling of threat. So there is this idea that there is a threat to national belonging, and this is a response to it. So in these discourses, what we see is that the headscarf becomes the otherness, and it's kind of a battlefield where it's defined who belongs to the nation and who doesn't. What the authors do is that they look for specific concepts that are used in this narratives, such as secularism, gender equality, republicanism. So these concepts, there are different concepts in each country, but there are also some commonalities between the concepts. Gender equality was one concept which was again and again and again used, I think. In France we have republicanism, in the Netherlands we have tolerance, etc. So I don't have time to go too much in depth. But what is important to bear in mind is that the meaning of the concept is really dependent on the country's context, really. So the historical context and the social political context but also on the actors, on the ones who participate in this discourse. And I think the main contribution again is that you really show both sides. So you show the mainstream discourse, you show how politicians and mainstream media construct the discourse and participate in this discourse, but you also show how Muslim women themselves participate in this discourse, but also non-Muslims who challenge these mainstream discourses, which is, I think, a very important contribution to this field. And I think one of the main arguments is really that there are processes of reaffirming on the one hand, but also of redefining specific concepts in this national narrative, and that's where the conflicts arise, because different definitions are given about the same concepts. So I think the cover uncovers really a lot of things in this context. So what we are presented with, it's more the standpoints of the viewer rather than the ones who wear it. Also, a very deep-rooted antagonistic feeling towards the veil, which was for me a bit heavy to digest as well sometimes. I mean, we have various examples. I don't want to go into depth, but please, for example, argue that it inspires visceral discomfort, like for the viewer really feels attacked by seeing a woman in a veil or also in a burqa sometimes. So it's really about the viewer who is being attacked and who is in an uncomfortable position. And it's also perceived as an Islamic assault as well, which is again about the viewer. I think what was very, very obvious in all these discourses was the projections on the veil. The own perspectives of the viewer and the ways in which these perspectives were projected on the veil, and in most cases they were by men in very powerful positions, and they were very paternalistic. And there are multiple processes of how the veil is being symbolized, of how it is being politicized. So in various narratives, the veil is seen as standing for political Islam, etc., or political protest. The book also shows, and I think that's also an area where we need to get deeper into, really how this supposed liberation of women often ends up in restricting and discriminating against them. And in some of the chapters you talk about the influence on the job market, etc. So how there are real effects of these kind of liberation processes. And then we also see that sometimes it's just political opportunism involved, which is also important to bear in mind. But I think most importantly, and I think that's maybe also your main argument, is that these concepts in the national narratives, the way in which they are being used, it's a very, very flexible way. The way in which we use secularism, the way in which we use gender equality, etc. It's flexible, but sometimes it's also contradicting, also dependent on who's participating in the discourse, and it's sometimes very biased as well. I wanted to go through a couple of concepts, especially secularism, because it's also my own area, where I think that it creates a lot of confusion. What is secularism? So, but for the sake of time, I will only go into the concept of gender equality, as this was a concept that was again and again used in the context of the headscarf. So, firstly, both authors emphasize that the discourse often, I mean, I'm talking here about the mainstream discourse, so the mainstream discourse in the political and media sphere, that the discourse ironically emphasizes gender difference by relating it to physical embodiment. Also that it reveals expected norms of performing femininity and exposing forms of dress. And then the issue of agency, what is when it is freely chosen. And then the issue of oppression, because there was this thing that I think also in France, when people were saying it's freely chosen, then the reaction was, but there is an inherent oppressive nature in the scarf. So we are not talking about the oppressor behind the practices of oppression, but we are projecting them on the scarf again. So I couldn't help but think about critical discourse analysis and Foucault and Stuart Hall. I really felt they are talking to me and telling me that I should bring them in, because they are basically saying that whenever a discourse happens, it is embedded in a power context. And when a discourse happens, it produces a specific knowledge about the other or about the specific group. But then when this knowledge is produced, this knowledge is justified for particular practices that are then used against this group. So Stuart Hall, he defines discourse and says, the knowledge which a discourse produces constitutes a kind of power exercised over those who are known. When the knowledge is exercised in practice, those who are known in a particular way will be subject to it. This is always a power relation. And they also say that the discourse enables the construction of a topic in a particular way, and it also restricts the construction of the topic in different ways. And the different techniques that are used in making meaning, they reflect specific worldviews, and they also prepare the ground for specific practices that are then justified. So we have the bans, we have discrimination in the job market, but we also have harassment on the street, and I think there is a lot of research needed, which is still not really happening, but these are practices and these are real-life effects happening on the ground. And what is important to bear in mind is that that these discursive practices, they objectify the individual. So the individual is an object, and the objectification, Foucault says, reflects how a group is seen as a problem. So to end my presentation, I just want to raise some questions, I think. And the first one is really, is it about defending values, or is it about the problem with the visibility of Islam? And the headscarf just manifests the visibility of Islam. And also this idea that, is it actually possible for a very strict, radical, secular, rationalist understanding to understand people who believe in God and who believe in the importance of religious practices? Will this be possible at all? Isn't radical secularism as oppressive as religious authoritarian regimes? Is it really about saving always, or is it sometimes also about paternalizing? And I also don't think that it's only men. I think it's also women. We always tend to say it's a man, they are the bad guys, they are the oppressor, but I think it's very often women as well, especially with very radical Western feminist conceptions of what it means to be liberated, etc. And we also have oppressive women in Muslim circles, of how they project their expectations on the headscarf, which is also a problem. So I think it's not necessarily gender related. I'm asking, did we overcome actually the problem of patriarchy with the headscarf bans? Is this how the problem should be solved? Shouldn't we problematize the practices that surround the headscarf rather than the headscarf itself, the practices of forcing women to veil in some countries or in some contexts, or forcing them to unveil? And this is a bit more philosophical, but still I think it's important, because all these national narratives are created in the context of the concept of a nation state. Shouldn't we problematize the concept of nation states? Because it forcefully wants to homogenize people, and it's also defined by difference, as Ruth was saying. So this idea of difference and of who belongs and who doesn't. And then at the end, I think my question is really, who owns the prerogative of interpretation? Who should have the authority to give specific meanings to things? And it's not only about the headscarf, it's also about concepts of freedom, it's also about state neutrality, secularism, and it's also about gender equality. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, after talking after an amazing set of comments. Yeah, it's personally a great joy to discuss this book, which I have observed coming to fruition from its very beginning. And this book is a product of a very special collaboration, a kind that I have to admit I've never seen before, and I don't think I'll see again. So I observed Gökçe and Anna crossing the Atlantic and meeting for several days and having amazingly intellectually intense working days where they literally sit next to each other at cafes and not only decide what to write about, but also write next to each other. And they told me that then they exchange what they have written and, edit what the other person wrote, which is really difficult when we think about this exaggerated sense of authorship and ownership that permeates in academia. And then they switch back again and continue from wherever they are left. And to me, they said they really don't know which idea belongs to who at this point, which I think is, really amazing and not heard of. And I also, so they work like that for hours on end, maybe 10 hours, 12 hours, taking breaks only to eat and to go to the gym and occasionally to look at store windows, I have to admit. Their commitment to the text is so intense that once in Berlin they were sitting at a cafe and at the end of the working day they noticed that their bags were stolen. So the thief must have realized their intensity, and I just imagine them noticing it at the end of the day. Okay, so Gökçe and Anna turned their 4 careful eyes to 4 different countries and give us a deeper perspective on how an issue that never lacked attention is much more complex, much more multifaceted, and internationally connected than we usually think. You were the first person, I think, to write about the Headscarf issue in Germany. In the last 25 years, much ink has been spilled, but reading this book, it still gives such a different perspective and shows how many people are involved in producing and maintaining this debate. So that was really striking. So they show us how the headscarf issue is the perfect nexus to understand intersections and constructions of religion, gender, and the public sphere in infinite permutation. Their approach is unique in showing us how headscarf debates have been productive in creating a space for re-articulating the nation in each of the 4 contexts. And I see this as the main strength of the book, seeing how the headscarf is not just a product of other tensions that are happening, but it's also productive of new ways of understanding the nation that I really benefited from thinking. And despite the exclusionary nature of the debate most of the time, they show how at the end the work of the most of the time marginalized, poor, and many times very young woman is productive and challenging of many founding blocks of the national narrative in all countries under discussion, although in different ways. In my own work on conversion to Islam in Germany, I also observed how totally individually motivated acts have profoundly transformative effects, not only on individuals, but also on the political system they are living in. Like converts to Islam, women who take on the headscarf in these 4 countries almost always make an individual decision. That is, they really go inside. They, I have many friends and people I did research with. It's a very difficult and a very personal process. Can I do it? Can I handle it? How will my family react? How will my parents react? How do I do this? Sometimes they try, in different contexts. Sometimes they just start and do it. But it's a very individual process. I mean, needless to say, there are cases in the world where women do not have the agency in wearing the headscarf, and there are other places where do not have the agency of taking it off. But research shows that at least in these 4 countries, wearing the headscarf is the woman's own choice. And in many cases, it is against the wishes of their families. Yet this individual decision has profound consequences. It both makes the person who dons the headscarf to notice the racist and sexist aspects of the society they live in a new light, and also they're wearing the headscarf, and especially making demands on being part of the public civic life with the headscarf, challenges the same racist and sexist social structure. A very easy act, done with a very simple and cheap piece of cloth, right? You can buy it for, if you want it, for a couple of pounds, a couple of euros, maybe a few pins, has bigger transformative and disruptive potential than many other acts that one can think of. Of course, even though the attention is on the headscarf, it is what is under the bodies of the racialized and gendered Muslim women who want to be fully present in the public is what creates the problem. What is trying to be excluded in the cases of France, Germany, and the Netherlands is not the headscarf, but the Muslim women. The Turkish case, of course, brings up how complicated the whole issue is. It shows how a Muslim country first adopted many of the French ideas of secularism and distinction between the private and the public sphere, even though it didn't make much sense to try to emulate in a Muslim majority context. It also shows how ideas about this are also easily reversible, and how a new space can be created for the headscarf, while the politics still remaining equally sexist and exclusionary. In Turkey now everyone is talking how the trend is reversed, and how now it is very comfortable for women wearing the headscarf, to come to the front rows. And many people see that it's very soon we'll be seeing that women who do not have the headscarf will be facing limitations. So you can have a ban on headscarf, and you can have a ban on having not wearing a headscarf, and do it while being sexist and exclusionary. So it's not about the headscarf, but it's on the attitude. Yeah, so there are many ways of being sexist, many ways of telling women what to wear and not to wear, and putting moral conditions for women if they want to be if they want to have a legitimate space in society. Another interesting observation that comes out of this discussion is the recent emergence of the debate on the niqab, the face veil. I found it really interesting how, as the headscarf became a common practice in Europe, and as a result more accepted, a very similar debate over the niqab came into being with very similar arguments. It gave pretty much the same actors the opportunity to discuss the same debate all over again. And reading about the debate brought to my surprise when I realized that a woman I met 5 years earlier in a Berlin mosque had started wearing a niqab. I had met her during the first phase of my research when she had just converted to Islam. At the time, she was studying fashion design in Paris, her long-time dream. There, she had met a Moroccan man who was not necessarily religious when they met. They got married and she converted to Islam. When I met her, she was back in Berlin for the summer to see her family. And she was just practicing on wearing the headscarf. And when I saw her 5 years later, she had the niqab. And because she was now wearing the niqab, they had to move to Germany because of the niqab ban in France. When I asked her about how it was like being a niqabi, she told me she gets the exact same set of reactions when she started wearing a headscarf about 5 years ago. She just told me that it only creates more curiosity because it's more novel. Some people wonder if it is limiting to her, or she said, if it is limiting to me, and others tell me I have the right to wear whatever I can, and it is cool and it's interesting. When I asked her about her decision to wear the niqab, the answer she gave me, as personal as it gets. She told me that after she converted to Islam about 5 years ago, she found peace at about 80%, she told me. But there was still something unpeaceful in her, something didn't feel right. When she finally put on the niqab, she felt like she is now fully peaceful. She said, now I feel that it is right. She also now felt more comfortable mixing in society, taking long walks, going shopping, driving her car, etc. She told me just, I feel complete and at peace. You know, that was the thing that came up again and again. When I asked her about her earlier dreams about being a fashion designer, she told me that she's looking for a job, but she thought it would be best if she can find a job where she can work from home, especially now that she had a son and was pregnant with another one. You know, so this issue of the personality of these decisions and then the major consequences that they have in the political life is something that I take home from this book. Okay, so now we'll have Gökçe and Anna to respond and talk about their book a little bit, and then we'll open it to discussion. Try not to take more than 10 minutes so that we have some time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much for these amazing comments, thoughtful comments to all three of you and Esra for organizing this event at the LSE. I have to say that what Esra was telling about our authorship is completely correct, very well articulated. Actually, I want to add one more thing, that we were working in Anna's office in Toronto, and one of us went to get coffee. When I was walking on the hallway, we were thinking about the same thing. And then I came back to the office and I said, Anna, I was thinking about this, and she was like, oh, I was exactly thinking about that as well. So it was like we have two minds in writing this book, and it's quite correct that this kind of authorship and it was turned into almost sisterhood. I find it very rewarding to publish together, and I also recommend my students, despite of the fact that in academia being a single author is very much emphasized, it's also very important to work in teams together, and especially try to write together to empower each other. We were actually very inspired by Ruth's earlier writing, especially in your book about Turkish challenges to citizenship in Germany, the notion of selective citizenship. And I know that it's not only us, but other people who wrote about multiculturalism in Germany. One of the things I remember, Yasemin Yıldız, she came to me one day and she said, I was at the U-Bahn in the metro station in Berlin, and there were a whole bunch of pictures of people to represent multiculturalism. And they were people who are, it's a picture on the metro, and all these people are standing next to each other. And Yasemin told me there's one person missing. That's the woman with the headscarf. So selective cosmopolitanism is a concept that Ruth uses in her book, and it says that what kind of cosmopolitanism in Europe we strive for. And I find this as a very interesting concept that I also use in my own writings. And it comes again and again in different contexts. And one of them is, and I'm gonna combine this with your issue of body, the visibility of body. As you said, and you know, what kind of visibility that we want. It's very selective. It's a form of cosmopolitanism, but it's selective cosmopolitanism, what people And it was very meaningful that you brought Foucault and Stuart Hall. In that case, that these power relationships are also institutionalized. We see this very much in the discourse of law, for example. I want to bring the 2014 European Court of Human Rights case for denial of citizenship to Faiza Silmi, the French citizenship. And there as well, it's so institutionalized, the discourse, the power that's used in order to select and make sure that this cosmopolitanism very much fits with the patriarchal, they are forced to wear it, she's forced to wear it, or what kind of cosmopolitanism that we want in Europe. One thing that also on this case, just nothing like this. It's about the institutionalizational law, protection. We were talking about projections. Projections, exactly. It's always said that we don't want. This is against gender equality. Wearing a headscarf is against gender equality. That's why we are against it. These women are forced to wear it, and it's so become everyday language and very much justified in legal language, including the European Court of Human Rights. So when you were talking about, Asma, the contribution of Turkey, I said you are going to say contradiction of Turkey, because the case in Turkey is stated, as Esra was also mentioning, in a very different way in that sense. And Esra actually explained it beautifully, so I don't have to repeat it, but in Turkish sense, sexism and in the quote-unquote racism works in both ways. And in the Turkish case, I felt really uncomfortable in talking to people, for example, because some women that we talked about were actually against AK Party's using of headscarf for election purposes, for example. And these were actually the women who were in the AK Party themselves. So, in the book there is a very interesting quote. A journalist said, "We came here, we become these people that we are, these women that we are, not because of them, but despite of them." So it also shows that they are doing a struggle within their own group in order to be recognized. I'm not going to, the comments were so rich, I'm going to only talk about a few of them. I know that Anna is going to complement my thoughts in that sense. Why newspapers, you said, Ruth? We were basing our idea on national narratives on Benedict Anderson, nationalism. And in that sense, newspapers are a place that this citizenship, this notion of nationalism reproduced. That's how we started. But then there were two critiques. One of them, why don't you do interviews? So we also started taking the interviews. Also, this was a fresh knowledge that's not reflected to the newspapers. And also, we looked at other media outlets like internet blogs, for example, YouTube videos, and they also brought another kind of knowledge, produced knowledge that's not reflected to the newspapers. About the transnational aspect and multimedia work, we are planning this to write something together that didn't fit into the book, but we want to also go further than that. Right now, I'm actually working on, and I want to say something what Esra's comments, this body's presence and visibility in the secular space. I'm now working on a piece on circumcision, ritual male circumcision debate. In 2012, there was a big discussion on whether ritual male circumcision in Germany should be banned or not. And the whole debate is very interesting, is about body. What kind of bodies are acceptable? And Esma was also relating to who has the authority to decide what kind of body we want in Germany. So this was the case in Germany, but generally in Europe there has been other kinds of debates. And this is not only about women's bodies or women's wearing of the headscarf. This is about body politics and who has the authority over making body visible, what kind of visibility of bodies we want. And this, as I said, this is not only about women's bodies, but it's also about men's bodies as well. We need to think about these kind of things in gendered terms, and that's not only women. So I'll leave it at that, and then I will give the word to Anna.
Yes, I also want to say thank you, and thank you for coming also. It's lovely to see people here in London, where I haven't been since I was 12, which is a very long time ago, where I left, and this is actually not totally unrelated. I was here when I was 12, I went to a market and I bought what I thought was this beautiful mirror. It had a painting of a woman on it, and it was a mirror, and I thought it was really chic and cool, and I bought it. And we went to visit the Tower of London. Now, I was 12 in 1977, and I left that package there.
Oh.
And I walked away, and within 5 minutes I noticed this. I ran back, and just as the police officers were converging on my package, thinking something was going to get blown up. Why is this not irrelevant? It's that when we think about creating a nation state, that is never an easy issue. There is always struggles about who belongs, who doesn't belong, who has access to political power, who doesn't. The question is, where is this discussion taking place? And I think what we did in our book is we said very front and center, we're going to set this headscarf front and center. It's not the only site. But it is a site that brings together this incredible multitude of strands, like horrible metaphors related to scarf and cloth and weaving and unveiling abound in the literature on this, and we're guilty of that as well. So I think and I'm really happy that I'm hearing that back from your comments, that we're able to do that. And then you raised some really important points. First, I want to take a step back briefly to our collaboration, much vaunted. Yes, we have one brain, we decided at some point. But the other thing is we bring two particular personal narratives to the relationship. So we come from different religious traditions, we come from different, I don't know if we are from different continents. Actually even that question is extremely political, because she grew up in Turkey and I grew up in Holland. So in one imagination, those are different spaces, and in another imagination, we're both from Europe. And then I really came of age in North America, but so did you. So there's all these, and it's exactly us working through and bringing those eyes to all these texts that we analyzed, where she saw things from her narrative, both personal as well as academic trajectory, and I saw it from mine, and then engaging, I think that really created the richness that I'm hearing back again in your comments. So I wanted to point that out. It's not just that we're one brain and similar, but we're also different on some really important dimensions. Then why did we put those eyes to newspapers? I would say, really, yes, I would love to spend ethnographic time in various, even here at the LSE. I'm fascinated by these spaces where people come together to learn the canon and the not-so-canon of thought and knowledge and etc. And how do we do that, again, with these different positionalities, and what does that tell us about who we are? The issue is that I think if you want to create a proxy for the sort of dominant, we played on the words, dominant, hegemonic, none is really satisfying, but kind of the newspapers are a fairly decent proxy for particular sort of what's out there, easily accessible, easily available. And then the question is, does it come back? So then when we go talk to Muslim women who are involved in political debates, when we look at these other blog spaces, we kind of did a check for seeing to what degree does this really resonate, or are there, what you in your work, as one called counter discourses in those places. So that was kind of the truth, jobs, children, internet, archives, all the newspapers are online. So there's also the reality of academic production, where we can take out time to go spend years somewhere else. I'm chair of my department. I'm never going to write a paper again. Transnationalism, absolutely, and it's still a question to us how we understand this, because it's so localized and so the particularities are so strong, and then the transnational currents are so strong. So how to really think through that deserves, I think, more attention than we could give it in the book. Somebody asked, should we problematize the notion of the nation state? Always. Always, by definition. Should we abandon it? I'm not sure that we can. Right? That's the question I'm up against. But I think it's almost an empirical, are we capable, if you think, it depends on how you define it, but if you think of nation state as a creation of a politics within the notion of belonging, I think it's going to be very hard because it's what draws us into politics to begin with, that there is some relationship, some commonality, right? So what are the grounds, I think, is what we need to interrogate. But again, that's a whole completely different and much more philosophical book than I'm able to write, and I think I have people like you can. I'm inviting you. And then finally, Richard, what you were saying about your work on the circumcision debate, which is fascinating, is that one thing we forget in many of these headscarf debates, they actually are debates about children. There are debates about teenagers, about people who are not legally adults. And that's another thing that I think is actually missing in our book, to some degree. But that idea of citizenship and reproduction, and how we regulate what teenage children and then young adults do. I think it's something that I want to think about more. It's not that I have an answer, but I think it's something to observe, that these are not just about us all being grown-ups together. It also is very much about how we create the next generation in multiple ways. So with that, thank you so much for these stimulating comments.